Hi folks, and welcome to my Nostalgia Trip Games again. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at the first 5 games for the ZX Spectrum, the Sinclair 48K rubber mat thing, which was actually the first computer that I ever had. My parents bought it back in 1984, 85 maybe. I don't know, I was about 3 years old at the time. And, well, the first computer that I had, I've actually kept it through the years, which I have it right here with the Finnish sticker on it and everything. But the thing is, it broke down about 3 times, and it broke down so badly after the 3rd time that my parents thought it was time for another computer altogether, one that would last more than 3 years. But, you know, I still have fond memories of it. Much games that I nostalgize about. Right now, though, I have 2 working Spectrums. This one unmodified 128K plus 2 model, the one with an inbuilt tape recorder, and then an AV modded 48K ZX Spectrum, which I bought kind of recently from a friend of mine called Yanni. Many thanks to him again. Well, the only slight annoyance about it is that the picture doesn't center properly, but that might have something to do with the TV I'm using. I'll have to check it out later on. Now, for those of you who don't know, the ZX Spectrum allows practically any home stereo cassette recorder connected to it through a regular 3.5mm phone connector. And it uses 2 different sockets for sending and receiving audio signals. For best possible loading success probability factor, some people seem to use specific sort of recorders that are more compatible for computer data. But I'm using this cheap home stereo thing with a cassette deck. Let's see here. That I bought from Claes Olsson some years ago. And it works well enough. Mind you, a mono cable works slightly better than a stereo cable, so for this episode, and probably the next Spectrum episode as well, when the time comes, I will be using this one just to see how it looks on YouTube. Oh yes, and once again, for the sake of convenience, I'll be using this SD card reader called DivMMC Future that I bought from the website called The Future Was 8-Bit. The first cassette that had a computer game in it that was loaded, well, attempted to be loaded into our second-hand bought 48K ZX Spectrum was Pole Position. Eventually, it loaded after a few attempts, but I don't think we ever got it working properly. I mean, when the game finally decided to run, we didn't know it was working because the title screen was blank. Well, it was blue, but it was blank. And maybe this is what should have been on the screen, though. Well, perhaps it didn't work, but the game managed to run regardless of the title screen not working properly, as I distinctly recall some racing-like action happening on the screen shortly afterwards. Because I was so very young at the time, I cannot recall whether I played it at all, or was it only my brother who did. Fast forward more or less 30 years onwards, and I have reacquainted myself with the Spectrum version of Atari's Pole Position, and I even bought it to complete my obsession. And I have to say, what a waste of time it is. Your car accelerates by itself and it happens excruciatingly slowly. But at least you can use brakes and shift gears between low and high as you should. The problem with the speed is that it never feels like you're making any progress. Or even that going 1 mile per hour and 150 miles per hour would have an invisible difference apart from your being able to pass some other cars. Barely. So, simply put, it's exhaustingly bad. But it's part of my gaming tapestry, for the lack of a better expression, and I torture myself with it once every few years, as if to see whether it has gotten any more playable since the last time. Nope, still hasn't. The second game I ever saw on the Spectrum, and probably the first game that I ever actually played, was included in the Horizons software starter pack cassette. The cassette itself was apparently never sold separately, so having that included with the second-hand Spectrum was a stroke of luck of sorts, I guess.
I suppose it could have been a good thing had I understood anything important that was included in the cassette. Almost the entire side A of Horizons includes tutorials on the ZX Spectrum hardware and programming. Side B includes various types of programs written in BASIC, the first of which was a simple breakout clone called Thro The Wall. To my 3-year-old eyes, this was much more interesting than any of the tutorials I had seen so far, and even more interesting than the miserable racing game that Pole Position was supposed to be. Sure, it's nothing special, and for any longer playing session can even be irritating due to the small bricks at the sides, which makes the game next to impossible to beat. So it's really for the simple reason of nostalgia, and perhaps the memory of it being more interesting than the specky version of Pole Position, that makes Thro The Wall a game I still tend to load up and play around every now and then. From the set of games included with the old Spectrum, I remember that Jetpack was loaded relatively late from the bunch. After the first load, it was easily the most played game until some new games were copied from a friend or a distant relative. I have to say though, Jetpack still remains one of the obvious choices to start with when I'm firing up a real Spectrum or an emulator. Many early games for the Spectrum were made with compatibility for the 16K model of the same rubbery beast in mind. Therefore, the basic setting for Jetpack stays the same throughout the game. You control an astronaut with a jetpack on your back and armed with a laser gun, and the idea is to first construct a rocket ship from 3 parts and then fill it up with fuel through 4 levels, all of which have exactly the same platformation, but which feature different kinds of enemies. After the 4 levels have passed, you are given another kind of a rocket ship to construct, but the same idea goes on until you lose your last life. Although the game is simplistic, there's a certain genius in its execution. The astronaut controls wonderfully, the difficulty level is spot on for the most part, and you always get a bit nervous entering the next level, in a good way. The graphics are, well, for the lack of a better expression, quintessentially Spectrum-like. And the sounds are, well, just listen to that. What's not to like, really? Skipping a few months ahead, we managed to get a hold of some more games from distant relatives and friends, and Percy the Potty Pigeon was one of the games that got copied onto one of our few 60-minute tapes of copied specky games. In fact, it was recorded as the first game on the cassette it was copied on because it became an instant favorite, and a rare occurrence of a game that even my mother would play every once in a while. Potty Pigeon puts you in the role of a bird mother, whose job it is to fly around town, look for worms wiggling in the ground, pick them up and bring them to your hungry offspring waiting impatiently in your bird nest in the first screen. On the other hand, it's more of an avoid 'em up, since most of the time you will be trying to avoid being hit by helicopters, frogs, cars and bird-eating plants, and you will also have to watch out for the red bird who will snatch your carried worm upon contact. The real bother is, though, that you have an energy meter you need to keep an eye on, since it will deplete when you're flying. The quick way to fill up your energy meter is to catch a fly, but more often than not, you will need to land down on some surface to catch your breath. If you're carrying a worm, though, make sure you don't land on the ground. Any other surface will do, because landing on the ground will make the worm fall off. As usual, there are various levels of difficulty, each of which add more dangers to your job. I suppose it's the role of the bird mother and a fairly harmless sort of overall feel to it which make the game so appealing and addicting. More than that, though, it's the clearly singular personality that the game has, which still works to this day. A very different sort of Potty Pigeon was also made for the Commodore 64, and I wrote about them in the very beginning of the comparison blog in August 2013. You can find a link for the article below the video in the description if you want to read more about them. Today's final entry is another racing game because I wanted to end this on a lighter note. Chequered Flag was another game that was touched upon briefly in Retro Game Talk Show's 3rd episode, since it was one of the games that arrived with the computer itself, and at the time I confessed that I couldn't really make much sense of it. Also, the first-person perspective was strangely off-putting back then, but I have to say, proper first-person racing games didn't really exist in 1983, so Chequered Flag was slightly ahead of its time. The game can boast of having 10 tracks and 3 cars to choose from, one of which uses an automatic gearbox, all of which are things you wouldn't really see getting close to in a first-person racing game until Accolade's Grand Prix circuit. Chequered Flag also features Road Hazard and the pits, but the gameplay is almost as elementary in being a simulation as the arcade game Night Driver from the 70s. Still, what Chequered Flag tried to achieve and what it managed to do is rather spectacular regardless of how good it actually plays. And to be honest, it's not nearly as unplayable as I make it sound here, it's actually surprisingly good. But the use of 2 keys for turning each way can become a bit bothersome. Nevertheless, an early racer exclusive to the Spectrum and much more worth having a look than Pole Position.